story.
I'm Katie Sefton here at the Lowell High School. I'm interviewing my grandfather, George William Sefton, on May 20th, 2005. When you were growing up, how did World War I affect your life and decision to join World War II?
My father had been an infantry company commander in the trenches in World War I, and I used to look at all of his memorabilia that he brought back and keep it in the window of his furniture store on Armistice Day. And he was my role model, I guess you'd call it. So I actually, after the National Guard was mobilized, they started the Indiana State Guard, and I got in that company, and this is before World War II had actually erupted, and enjoyed it. Enjoyed the order, the discipline, enjoyed the comradeship of the people that were with me. So when the war broke out, that was obviously the direction I was going to take.
Elaborate on your upbringing with your brothers and sisters.
What was that?
Elaborate on your upbringing with your brothers.
Well, I was the oldest of 4 children, and we were 2 years apart right down the line, a sister, a brother, another sister. And it was a Depression-era family. My father's furniture business was a struggle, but we had a lot of fun. We were very happy. Our mother was a wonderful woman, wonderful cook. Had the good sense to have us all washed, bathed, and in bed by the time Dad got home at 9 o'clock at night. But it was a close-knit family. It was not at all dysfunctional.
How were you educated prior to the war, and how did that affect you during World War II?
Went to Catholic parochial schools. We spent 3 years down in Rushville, Indiana, with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. And then came back to Anderson, Indiana, which is our hometown. And again, there was a certain amount of discipline there. At quitting time, we lined up in the hall in formation and marched out to the Notre Dame fight song.
Where were you brought up, and describe the pre-war atmosphere?
Well, it was raised in Indiana, in Anderson, and the pre-war atmosphere at the time was a lot of people were very concerned about jobs. There was a lot of people were living on credit. I remember I'm sure that I think it was until after the end of the war that my parents managed to pay off all the debts they had. But they were ordered times. There was very little strife like you have today. Everybody knew they had to work hard, and I think that it had a lot to do with the attitude of the people that have been called the greatest generation, because we were tempered. You knew that nobody's going to give you anything for nothing. You had to earn it. You had to work for it. You had to get along with people.
What would you say had the greatest influence on your decision to join the war?
As I say, my admiration and respect and love for my father, plus the fact that I wanted to find out what it was all about. I'm sure of that, as a lot of people did. That you would have felt very bad not going to see the elephant. Once you got to see him, it wasn't so nice. But it was, first place, it was our country. And I think that pretty universally, guys at my age felt that it was your duty and your obligation to defend it. And none of my friends, felt any different.
How did you decide to be a paratroop officer?
Well, I guess I wanted to do something that not everyone would do. I thought I'd try to live up to my father's service, and it was kind of a thing that I'd never, in high school we didn't have a football team. I was never a jock. I was a healthy kid. I was good at hunting and fishing and trapping and things like that, but the way they pictured it, you were going to do things that not everyone would do, and which of course made a lot of us want to do it.
So what exactly did paratroop officers do in that time?
Well, first of all, you had to go through basic infantry training if you're going to be an infantry paratrooper, vis-a-vis artillery or something else. And then after you got through your basic training, in my case, I managed to pass the board to go to Officer Candidate School, Fort Benning, Georgia. I had joined the Army asking for paratroops for airborne, and I asked again when I was sent there, and the company commander went on leave without putting the recommendation through. So I ended up guarding the locks at Sault Ste. Marie for 3 months with barrage balloons and an aircraft battalion and an infantry regiment. As soon as I got there, I put in for airborne again, and in December I got my orders to go join the 501 Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was just being formed at that time.
So let's back up a little bit. Tell us about your training experiences.
Training experiences? We got our troops for the regiment as being formed right out of the reception center, and we gave them basic training. And then we had to go to jump school at Fort Benning. And the emphasis in the first week was all on physical conditioning, but we had gone through so much of that we skipped that week. The second week, we learned how to jump out of a fuselage on the ground, the proper exit mode, to put your hands outside the fuselage, put your left foot in the door, kick out with your right. We also learned to do tumbles, sliding down a cable with the instructor running along behind you, and he could trip it anytime he wanted. And you had to learn, hit the ground and do a right front tumble or a left front tumble. That's to keep you from getting hurt when you jumped. And we also then in the third week we went on the high towers, like they pull the chute up there. And the first would be a controlled thing, and you come down right with it. And then they got so they cut you loose, and then you came down 250 feet, hit the ground, and learned to tumble, learned to the proper landing position and what have you. And then the fourth week, you jumped out of airplanes. You had to make 5 jumps to qualify for your wings. And the first jump was the easiest one I ever made, because throughout our training, training the regiment, about half the officers had already been through jump school, and the other half of us had not. And so we always were looked down on by those that already had their wings, and there's nothing going to keep me in that plane.
Tell us about your first day of service in the war effort of World War II.
The first day in combat? Okay. We were an elite unit. We were highly trained. And the mission of the regiment was to establish capture bridges and things behind the front lines, and also to block the causeways that came in from the seaborne beaches, so the Germans could not cut them off coming across. They were to hit the beaches at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we hit them at 1:30 at night. We were there 5.5 hours before they were. The plans were immaculate plans, very extensive. You know, I was a battalion intelligence officer, and I remember having my S2 section carve out. We had aerial photographs of where we were going to be, carve out replicas for the farmhouses and crossroads and everything. And we had 2 folding bicycles the English had used. And one scout was going to get on this bicycle and go to that place and see if there's any enemy there. Another was going to go here. And it was all, the adjutant was going to have a green lantern and blow whistles, and we were all going to assemble neatly. And the planes were going to slow down to 90 miles an hour and raise the tails, so it makes it so not so much prop blast shock. The first part worked just right. They did cross the channel. we actually flew around the Coatman Peninsula and came in from the opposite side, so we were flying toward the invasion beaches. And we had 8 minutes flying time to our objective, our drop zone. We had hardly hit the French coast, and we had low cloud banks. Now the planes were flying in V's of 3, and there were some 42 planes in a serial, and you had 18 men in a plane. Now these pilots were as green as we were. This was their first day in combat. They immediately started spreading out so they wouldn't crash into the plane beside them. And when they emerged in the cloud bank, a lot of them didn't even know where they were. One battalion of ours was scattered over a 60-mile square area. Fortunately, we were following them. And I remember yet looking out the door of the plane because I was jump mastering the stick. That meaning I was going to stand at the open door. I was going to give them the command to jump. Then I was going to jump last. The main reason being because we were going to throw out the equipment bundle that had their machine gun and things of that nature. I didn't want to get between the squad and their equipment. Okay? At any rate, I could look down ahead and I could see fires burning on the ground. And now the troops, we had stood up and hooked up 5,000 yards offshore. That was our orders. There's a little red light that goes on. The pilot says that means you stand up and hook up. You don't jump till he turns on the green light. The pilot does that, okay? At any rate, I can look down ahead of me and see these fires burning, and I yelled to the troops, hey, we're in great shape. The Air Corps has bombed everything. There are all kinds of houses burning down there. I didn't realize till 2 days later that those were not houses. Those are planes shot down from the serial ahead of us. I had studied the terrain. I knew exactly where we were supposed to jump. And we had this equipment bundle on the floor of the plane that we had to throw out. So I had the squad leader there and the crew chief, and we were easing it toward the door, and I sensed something was going on outside. I just felt there was. So I looked out the door, and my thought was, Sefton, you do not need this parachute. You can walk down any one of those streams of tracers coming up at us, like the 4th of July. And I kind of flinched behind the door just instinctively, and all the guys started squatting. I initially realized I'd made a major mistake in troop psychology, so I stood back in the door and stuck my head out, turned around and yelled, "It's okay, they can't hit us." Just at that moment, about 8 rounds went through the plane, probably 50 caliber. It sounded like somebody hammering on it with a sledgehammer. The plane by this time is going wide open, and the red light is still on. I kept looking at the red light, and I can see the drop zone, slipping by behind us. I recognized it. We were right on it. And I kept looking at the red light, and finally I could see puffs in the sky. Everybody else was jumping off our flanks. So I yelled, "Let's go!" And we went to shove the equipment bundle out, and the slipstream caught it and turned and jammed sideways. I don't know how long it took. It only seemed like 10 minutes. It probably took all of 4 seconds to kick it out. The men went out like brrr, one right after the other. They were that panicky to get out of the plane. The number 6 man, the plane was lurching. He fell against the door. The barrel of his carbine broke through the paper tape between the 2 thicks of aluminum, and he was stuck there, probably for half a second. They were piled up on him so fast that I think 5 of them went out once. As the number 12 man came down, he didn't have to jump, because the plane turned up on its left wing and it threw him out. And in that instant, I could see the moon shining in water, and I could see what appeared to be whitecaps. I tried to stop the next 4, yelling, "Stop, we're over the ocean." What I'd actually seen, and what no single air photo interpreter had recognized, photos taken 24 hours before, The Germans had closed the lock on the river, so the tide going up couldn't go up, it just spread out. And I was looking at about 8-10 inches of water and the tops of the reeds flowing like that. I was still convinced the other four just overran me. I couldn't stop them. And I really thought we were over the ocean. And you can think of my father, who's by now, he'd gone back into the Army, and he was in Italy. And the one thing they had made perfectly clear, whatever else you do, do not come back on the plane unwounded. Because that would be desertion in the face of the enemy. So I didn't really jump. I just stood like a log and fell out of the plane. Thinking they had we all had Mae Wests, these inflatable things. It takes 83 feet for a chute to open because of the length of the static line and the suspension lines, the risers. And the first thing you do when you're trained is look up to see if it's open. I looked up and hit the ground at the same time. So I figured I jumped at 90 feet and plowed into soft ground. Now, at first I was on an island. I wasn't. I landed about a mile behind the beach. And the rest of that, there was one incident there because my father had given me his World War I .45 pistol because junior officers were issued carbines, not pistols. But almost every one of us had gotten one from someplace. He wanted as much armament as you could have. And I hit the ground, and when we jumped in Holland, we had a quick release device on the front of the chute. All you had to do was turn it, hit it, and your whole chute fell apart. We didn't have those in Normandy. They were like dog leash snaps. And at the speed we jumped, and with all the weight we had on us, they became very tight. And of course, everybody's a little excited, and I certainly was. And I seemed to couldn't get them loosened. So I grabbed my knife and was cutting myself out. And I could hear hobnailed boots pounding the ground, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see moonlight shining on bayonets. And I found I'd wired the pistol with baling wire so I wouldn't lose it. So I rolled over to my side to see who was going to capture me or kill me. And this little group of cows skidded to a halt. And the lead cow put her nose about that face of mine and said, "Moo." They turned around and ran off, and they still sounded like hobnails and boots pounding the ground, and the moon on their horns still looked like bayonets. Throughout that night, after I got myself cut out of my chute, there was another kid there that couldn't get out of his, and identified myself. We had these crickets, General Taylor's idea, click, click. And if you clicked a cricket and you had a friend, he'd click back twice. We were also supposed to use a password. If somebody was coming, you would challenge Flash, and he would answer welcome or thunder, and you would say welcome. The reason they had the word welcome, if it were German, he would pronounce it welcome. so you would start shooting. But at any rate, all the way across there, the one thing they had told us, if things are all messed up, which they certainly were, go to where the fighting is. So the first guy I cut loose, identified myself, and says, "Lieutenant, what's your plan?" Plan? I said, "Follow me." Found 3 more just 50 yards away. Same thing. What's your plan? Went along through that marsh, picking up Geronimos, figured about better part of 2 or 3 miles from the high ground where I could see the tracers and you'd see a stream of tracers, and then X seconds later you'd hear the sound. You could tell how far you were away to some extent by that. Everyone, I think the first 10 men I found, first question that they'd ask me, "What's your plan?" and I would say, "Is your weapon loaded?" "Oh, no." Where are your grenades?" "Oh, in my pocket." "Load your weapon, take out your grenades, hook them on your harness." We kept going, and by this time I had about 60 men with me. And one very memorable occasion, I just picked up a machine gun team of 2 men. And the little guy was carrying the gun, the big guy was carrying the tripod. And I just picked them up in the field, but this time we had crossed. They didn't have hedgerows down there, they had ditches. And they were all flooded. And you could wade out to where you saw the grass stop on a ditch, and if it was took up close enough, you could just simply jump it. And we'd been doing that. And in this one field, I picked up this machine gun team, and they said, "What's your plan?" I said, "Fall in." So they were right behind me. We got to the next ditch. I looked and saw the grass. I just jumped across, and as soon as I hit, I thought, I wonder if they've crossed any ditches yet. I turned around to say, "Watch the..." The little guy stepped in, and he was gone. Nothing there, except bubbles coming up. I waited for him to come up. I finally got down on my knees and reached down as far as I could, and I could feel the top of his helmet. He's standing there with a machine gun. I got him in. It was my job to get him out, apparently. Fortunately, he still had his chin strap fastened. I got it underneath of his helmet edge and lifted him up. Now, you would think he'd be grateful. He called me names that even I hadn't heard before. That's the kind of things that was going on. Finally, I was challenged by a voice I recognized. It was the major who was the regimental operations trained and planning officer. He had a question. "Sefton, what's your plan?" I said, "Well, Major, they told us the things are all messed up to go where the fighting is, and it's up on that high ground. That's where I'm going." "Good plan, Sefton. You take 12 minutes a point, and I'll follow with the main body." We hadn't gone 100 yards, and we came to the grandfather of all ditches. It was at least 25 feet wide and had like a telephone pole laying across it. Oh, I had suggested to the major that, "Okay, we'll do this, but you see that little bunch of trees that seem to be about halfway up to the high ground?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "When I get there, I'll stop and we'll refine the plan." I led my men across that, using our weapons like balancing sticks. Got across, got about 100 yards, 200 yards in, looked back, and the major looked at that. I think what he'd actually realized is that one of our objectives was off to the left, which was to capture the locks. But anyhow, here goes the column. That didn't seem till the next day. Anyhow, by the time I arrived at the battalion command post, I had more men than the battalion commander did. I'd also run across my own section sergeant, laying on the ground, giggling, almost hysterically. And he said, "They tried to kill me. They tried to kill old Pop." They call him Pop because he's 29 years old, I commandeered his Tommy gun because, as far as I'm concerned, we were going to go into the assault. And he said, "By the way, Colonel Ballard's right up there by that hedgerow." I was about to assault our own battalion command post. I think one that typified that night to me, we were looking for more men, and I was walking with the battalion commander just across a hedgerow. The moon was intermittent. It would come in and go off as the clouds came across. And here was one of our guys sitting on a big lump of clay beside a bomb crater. And he's sitting here with his rifle across his lap, and we challenged him. He turned to Colonel Ballard and said, "What unit, soldier?" He said, "D Company, 501st. I said, I'm your battalion commander. Come on over here and join us." I said, "Love to, Colonel, but I've got a broken leg." And he was sitting there, having broken his leg on the jump, carrying his rifle across his lap, waiting for somebody to come along in his coal scuttle helmet so he could shoot him. We had people like that, We were that geared up. We were that well trained. That's the kind of morale we had. You want to go on to Holland now or something? I could spend 2 days talking about Normandy.
We'll go into that in a second. During the first few days, what were you thinking and feeling about the military, your mission, and your home?
First few days in combat. Okay. Oddly enough, I didn't feel any vestige of fear. I did feel a shock. I looked down and see all that tracers coming up. That here were people I hadn't even been introduced to, and they were trying to terminate my military career. I think the shock was such that I went into back to the field manual mode. All I could think about is what I've got to do, how I've got to do it, how to do it well. It was simply the obvious in the mess, They've told me what I got to do. Let's go do it. I think it was almost automatic, and I don't think I was the only one that felt that. But it was, you were plunged into a situation that you thought about, but you hadn't really imagined what it was like.
What was going through your mind when you were approaching combat for the first time?
Well, I just told you that.
Well,
do my job.
When you were in the plane.
Oh, in the plane. Well, that's when I realized, when all those tracers are coming up at us, that we were probably going to have a bit of trouble on the ground. And also when I realized how fast the plane was going and how wildly it was starting to maneuver, that the pilot wasn't really thinking of the welfare of the paratroopers.
Okay, tell us about Holland.
Okay. We survived Normandy, and after we'd had about 10 days of fighting in the hedgerows, we were moved up to near Cherbourg, which was the big port that the 4th Infantry had finally captured. And then we went back to England, and we sent in for replacements and what have you. And there's one flashback there that I forgot to mention. The night that I was taking the troops out of the thing and got to the point where I felt we had to start a plan after we left the major. I had 2 lieutenants by that time also. So I called a council of war. I'm going to sit down, and 3 of us are going to figure out just what we're going to do. And I sent one man out in front as a security, and one to the right, and one to the other side, and one to behind. And after we decided the plan was going to be that I was going to take the first 12 men and be the point, and if we hit anything I couldn't go through, they were to take each half of the rest and attack fast. But anyhow, we got ready to go. I said, pick up the security. We went off. Now we're back in England, and the lightly wounded are coming back. And I was out there just watching them get off the truck, and all of a sudden this little guy standing beside me, and his face is red, and he says, "Lieutenant, do you remember me?" I said, "Sorry, soldier, who are you?" He said, "You remember me of the first night in Normandy?" I said, "I'm sorry. I don't have the foggiest idea of you the first night in Normandy." He said, "Well, you should have. You put me behind a bush and left me there all night." Put yourself in this position, I just sent him out there and then told the others to go get him. And the big moral of that lesson is not every order in combat is well given, and not all of them are obeyed. So this poor guy sat there all by himself, and all of a sudden he's all alone in the war. He had every right to be a little ticked off. Now, anyhow, we went back to England, and we got replacements. We lost 38% of our command in Normandy. A lot of them were lightly wounded and were waiting for us when we got back. A lot of them were missing, a lot of them were killed, a lot of them were severely enough wounded that they didn't come back to the war. But at any rate, we get back to England and we start training again. And one thing I asked the battalion commander, "Sir, I was the battalion intelligence officer. Please let me go back to a rifle company where I'd come from. Sefton, we got to have another mission. We haven't got time to train anybody else. You're staying in your job." So now we're going into Holland, and this is going to be a daylight jump. Now you got to bear in mind that the 1st Airborne Army, they came back, they formed an army. When we jumped in Normandy, the British division had jumped with their mission, and our 2 airborne divisions had jumped with their missions. Then they combined them all into the 1st Airborne Army. Now you got to, if you know your history of the breakthrough at St. Lo, it took them almost 20 days to fight through the hedgerows to get to where the hedgerows started to end when you had open ground. And that's where they used every bomber they had to flatten the Germans. And when they eventually broke through, Patton, his armor was pouring through, and in fact, he wrote a friend of his, retired old friend in the States, and he said, "It's like the old days of the cavalry." you gallop off in all directions with a saber in each hand and a pistol in the other. That's the way it was. And the Airborne Army actually planned 13 different missions before we made a jump, because Patton would get there first, you know. We actually went to the marshalling area for one of them, so we're supposed to jump on the border of the Belgian-Dutch border, and again it was canceled. When we finally did go in, the plan called for, and this was Montgomery's plan that he managed to sell to Eisenhower. They're going to go on a single axis of advance, one major highway, 60 miles, capturing every bridge on the way, and to Arnhem, over the Rhine. From there, if we succeeded in doing that, they were headed in tank company into the industrial heart of Germany. The only thing they looked in the plan was the enemy. The road was elevated. We flew in broad daylight on a Sunday afternoon. We flew right over the German lines. You know, they looked down and shooting at us with their rifles. Our regiment was the furthest one in of the 101st. The 101st, 506, was to capture Eindhoven. 502 was in the same area. We were 25 miles further in at the village of Beckel. We were to capture the bridges over the Wilmsvaart Canal and the Aar River. It was almost like a parade ground jump outside of the relatively light flak. We had so much air cover, so many of the fighter bombers are going in and knocking out the anti-aircraft guns. We did lose a few planes. But it was a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I think the regimental commander did jump us 1,000 yards too soon, but floating down, it's balmy weather, hit the ground, and I still see soldiers sitting there cutting up their camouflage shoots for make some scarves or mementos for their girlfriends or whatever. The Dutch underground was out there in force, helped us pick up equipment. There was one guy in civilian clothes with the American captain's bars on his collar saying, "Why were you so late?" The Dutch kids on bicycles, 13, 14, 12 years old, were scurrying all over the countryside, telling us where the Germans were. It was almost the first day of like a comic opera war, almost, you know. In fact, it was. The priests were passing out beer and pretzels in the streets. That part of the Holland was very Catholic. I managed to get on the way up to get to the objective. I passed a friend of mine who was on the regimental staff, and there's this little village of Eerde, about half a mile from Beckel. And he said, "Sefton, if you see the regimental commander, tell him we're setting up a temporary headquarters here." Well, things settled. There were some fires, a few rounds being fired up ahead. But I did get up to the battalion commander, and we were standing there along the Wilmsvaart Canal on the far side. We had the bridge, and everything's fine. And here comes a bus rolling down the road, paralleling the canal. Now, but you bear in mind, there were Geronimos all over the place, so you could have had the American flag on. And battalion commander yelled, "Stop that bus!" Everybody and his brother opened up on it. It veered off the road. The only casualty on the bus was the bus driver had part of a lobe of his ear shot off. He had a 14-year-old Nazi youth kid on there, full uniform. He was so snotty, I wanted to turn him over my knee and whap him. He was trying to spit in our eye. In the course of that, though, I did... the battalion commander told me to go down, go across the highway bridge, go back down and see if D Company had the railroad bridge secured. One of the Dutch kids handed me a bicycle, handed me his. So I'm going across the bridge on the bicycle, and there's a regimental commander right in the middle of it. And I remembered about his staff. I said, "Colonel," I said, "part of your staff's in that, where you can see that church spire down there in that village." "Fine, Sefton, go down and get them for me." When the battalion commander already given me a mission, so then he turned away. I thought, "Well, I better go back and tell Colonel Ballard that Colonel Johnson sent me on this." I went back and said, "Sir, Colonel Johnson wants me to go do this." He said, "Sefton, I told you to go down and see what Dog Company's doing. Now go." So So now I'm tiptoeing across the bridge, his head back to me. He turned around to the regimental commander. Sefton, I told you to go to that bridge, get my staff, get in that car and go. Here's this little mini car with a rumble seat, one tire shot out, bullet holes and blood. That's part of the rear echelon that gotten caught. And an S2 driver, and I thought, well, it's not that far. You get down and get back, and battalion commander won't even realize I'd gone. So we're rolling down the tire flapping, and the highway made a slight jog. And there are two Geronimos there, two of our guys in a foxhole. They hadn't dug it. The Germans had dug foxholes along almost all the highways because of the strafing of American fighter planes. And they yelled, "Get off the road, there's a tank coming." The driver simply cut the wheel and went through the ditch and plowed into the far edge of it. I've never had any acrobatic training, but I did a complete flip in the air and landed standing up on the far side of the thing. At that time, the guy yelled, "It's okay, it's a limey tank." Well, we had been told at the airport that Monty had already kicked off, and broken through. He's supposed to reach us in 24 hours. Well, he's making better time yet. So I step out in the middle of the highway, and I'm probably going to be a Stars and Stripes reporter with him, and I should have some quote to make that'll, to what I said to him. Dr. Livingston, I presume, had been used. And this guy's coming roaring down the highway, and the tank commander is up waving at me like this, And I'm standing there with an M1 rifle that I decided to use instead of a carbine. And I'm thinking, several times in combat, they get this little man talking in my ear. And I'm thinking what I'm going to say to that guy, and this little man is saying, "That's a funny color for a limey tank. They paint theirs OD like ours. The guy's wearing a black cap. No, limeys wear black berets. What Army wears a black cap?" At that time, I realized it's a camouflage, but it's got a German Iron Cross on the front. By now, he's probably about as far away as that partition down there. And he stopped waving because he has a Luger in his hand, and he's bringing the Luger down, and I'm trying to bring the M1 rifle up to shoot from the hip. He shot first. I heard the bullet snap by my ear, and I fired almost at the same time. I jumped out of the way, and he did throw his hands up in the air and go down the turret. I don't know whether I missed him by 10 feet or hit him in the brisket, but the tank goes roaring by, and there's a bazooka team right there. And I'm yelling, "Get him, get him, get him!" And the guy is tracking him at, about 3 feet from me in the bazooka. I could see he was pulling the trigger. Nothing was happening. I looked down. They hadn't hooked up the wire. On a bazooka, there's a little coil of wire you got to hook to a coil down there in order to make it fire. He fired, and I was at the angle. I could actually see the bazooka shell, like a hard-thrown baseball. It went out, it hit the turret of the tank, and went straight up in the air. He'd forgotten to pull the pin that armed the projectile. That's at any rate, we did take all of our objectives. We were hit very fiercely 2 days later by an German armored infantry attack. The Dutch kids had told us they were coming up this road. The battalion commander told me to take a demolition team and a rifle squad for protection and go out and mine the bridge that went over the River at that point. So I went out, found the bridge, deployed the rifle squad, told the demolition team to start wiring the bridge to blow it up. Went back to tell the battalion commander I'd accomplished the mission. They hadn't been there 15 minutes till here came the point of this armor infantry battalion roaring up the road. They did hit the detonator. They hadn't had time they didn't have the equipment to go under the bridge and work in the water. They just laid it across the top. And from accounts I heard later, they blew a 1-inch crack all the way across the bridge, which did nothing to stop the German armor coming in. But we did survive that part too. There were a lot of experiences there, but the Dutch people were so good, and to this day are so grateful, that a lot of people made a lot of really good friends there and still go back and visit them. Once the 82nd Division had taken the bridge at Nijmegen, the British armor stopped, and just only a couple of miles or so from the bridge at Arnhem, where the British airborne dropped, and that was, for any of you that have seen the movie The Bridge Too Far, that was where they were getting butchered, and the British tank stopped for tea. I'm not literally. Actually, and they just crossed the bridge that the 82nd Airborne had saved for them, and they're getting out and stopping for tea. And our troopers are swearing at them. Those are your guys up there. They are still fighting. Well, I say, but the infantry isn't up yet. Well, they had a point, because the whole fallacy in that operation was they're using an elevated road that in many places you couldn't get off of it with the tank. And the Germans had this marvelous 88 millimeter cannon that they could sit 1,000 yards off the flank, pick off the lead tank, pick off the back tank, and take their time chopping up the column. And it was our job to try to keep them far enough away that they couldn't do that. And the British were pretty bloodied at that time, but they did not take Arnhem. We ended up going up and relieving the British on this side of the Rhine. And when we got up there, the main dike had a 2-lane road across it. Then there was an open space in the small dike along the river. And the front line when we got there was that 2-lane road. The British held one side, the Germans held the other. Hear each other cough, spit, And one of our Geronimos came up with the idea of taking suspension line cord and if you threw a grenade across, if it went in one of their holes, they'd throw it back. If they didn't, they'd roll down the embankment and go off harmlessly at the bottom. One of them got the idea of taking white phosphorus grenades, tying them on the cord, lobbing them across, hanging on to the end of the thing so they're dangling just alongside the German foxholes, and they burn them out in one night. But we were up there. We were supposed to have 10 days of hard fighting. Only supposed to have 3 days of hard fighting in Normandy, and only 10 days or so in Holland. We were there 72 days. We got back, and again, we had close to 40% losses of our people. We got back to France this time, and we turned in all the damaged weapons, and we're getting replacements, and we're not supposed to jump again until we cross the Rhine in March. They were sending leave trains to Paris, and we were planning a football game between two of the regiments. And we were there 3 weeks, and the Battle of the Bulge broke out. And on a Saturday night, they alerted us to get ready, and by Sunday afternoon, we had the whole regiment crammed onto these cattle trucks, we call them. No top, nothing, just you could jam 50 men in. They couldn't lay down, but you could get them in there. And there was one great story involved with that I've always liked, because I think it had said something about the kind of guys we have. The regimental band had been left behind in Normandy, and they'd been left behind in Holland, and they wanted to go. I mean, there was no commander for them, They wanted to, we came to join this outfit to fight. Now's our chance. We want to go. They asked our Catholic chaplain, Father Sampson, but he was a tremendous guy himself, one of the bravest men I ever knew. He says, I can't tell you you can go, but I can't tell you you can't. So they scrambled around trying to find weapons. They climbed on the truck, They finally got to combat. We drove all night with the headlights on, foggy night, the headlights blazing. If there could have been any German planes up, that would have been a catastrophe. It was about 3:30 in the morning. We pulled into fields. I remember I laid down in a ditch with some mud in the bottom of it. Then you know where we were, really. Down at our level, down at the platoon level, we didn't know where we were. Got up in the morning, and we were the first regiment into Bastogne. Bastogne had been captured earlier by the Americans, The front had moved way on past it. Now it's coming back. On the way down, we see all kind of vehicles going the other way. Where are we? Why are they going that way? We're going this way. I remember a little stubby sergeant from the 28th Division, which had been badly overrun and mauled, standing on the edge of town. We saw the sign that said Bastogne. He's saying, "Go back, go back. There's 1 million of them out there. There's 1 million of them out there." I said, we're paratroopers. Don't worry about it. I remember this one guy that went into battle. Well, a lot of guys didn't even have weapons, but one guy picked up a branch of a tree about like a baseball bat, and I guess he's going to beat him to death. Get a weapon. Our 1st Battalion crossed the line of departure in the early dawn, first ones across. And they managed to get 2 miles out of town until they ran into the point of the Panzer Division coming in. Heavy fog, each of them thought they'd hit a roadblock. Each of them went to ground. The Panzer Division had actually stayed there overnight because some civilian had said he saw about 40 American tanks going that way, so they'd be behind him. There weren't any 40 tanks. It was, I don't think the guy was lying. I think he'd seen part of the 9th Armored Division, but now out there being trapped. At any rate, our battalion commander, regimental commander, they're around this little village of Neff. He flanks our battalion to the left to get around so they can knock this roadblock out. The German the commander flanks his reconnaissance battalion to his right. So we meet. The regimental commander flanked the reserve battalion to his right to try to get a village over there that would flank Neff, just as the German commander deployed a unit to his left, and they meet. And that's the way the siege of Bastogne developed. It took 4 days, actually, before we were completely surrounded. But the fighting became very bitter, especially after it turned cold. And while we were surrounded there, we were low on ammunition and food, but they did finally, on Christmas Day, the skies cleared, and the C-47s flew in all through all that flak and dropped ammunition, and the first thing they dropped was a surgical team. I left out the point that our entire division hospital unit, because they didn't want to be endangered, they kept them out in back of town. The Germans managed to cut the thing and captured them all. So now we're down to regimental and battalion surgical units. And as the wounded piled up, they were in real tough situation. But we managed to, as long as we were sitting in the holes, we were killing Germans 4-1 because they had to come at us. And by this time we got a foot of snow on the ground toward the end. Once Patton broke through to us, it was our turn to attack. And we had to go floundering through the snow, and the Germans are in prepared positions. And that's where we really started taking casualties. I took 40 men into Bastogne, and 14 of us came out. Now, some of them were just wounded. Some of them had frostbitten feet. They weren't all killed, but they were no longer able to fight. So we did then. They rushed us down to what was called the Bitch Bulge, the town Bitche in Alsace-Lorraine, where the Germans had broken through partially. By the time we got there, the units there had pushed them back, and it became a pretty static warfare on the river. The only thing I really remember about it was with the 14 men I had, we were at the left flank of the whole damn regiment. And the Motor River was right across from us, and the Germans had all the woods and the high ground across. And we'd be up on line 6 days and back in the village 3. They rotated the units. And we'd been back for 3 days, and the spring thaw had come. In the position that we'd been in, there were foxholes along a little lateral road. The guys were laying beside them because they're full of ice water. And I called back and asked, can we go over the top of the ridge? Because the Germans weren't about to attack. They were really beat up. And dig a reverse slope defense. No, you can't do that. one of the worst moments of the war for me. We dug all night. And I remember that the slope of the hill was such that we were 2 feet deep in the front and 6 feet in the back. We covered them with boards and we put sod over them, what have you. And the next afternoon, I had all that night I'd been not only helping dig, but also going to see how well the others were doing. One of the ingenious things I found, there was a huge pile of rutabagas down there. Now, this is night. I couldn't keep an eye on it. One machine gun team just climbed up on the top of that rutabagas, threw enough out so till they were down in it. That was their position. I had to admire their ingenuity, but that time it was getting light. There was nothing else I could do about it. But I had the people in 2-man foxholes, and I had put the medics. A road came down to there and made a jog. There's actually a defilade position. That's where I'd put the medics in the machine gun. This one gun, just to my left, was a hole where the guys got tired of digging and went up on top of the hill. There's an orchard there, and they brought down a whole bunch of prunings and just stacked it in front of them. I was making my last check. It was starting to get light, and there was nothing else I could do except chew them out. I said, I just hope the Germans don't think any American could be stupid enough to use this in front of a foxhole. About mid-afternoon, one single gun started pecking away at us. I think the first round cut our communication wire because he kept calling back to trying to get the mortar support. There's been nothing. It went on all afternoon. Just slowly, I think we had 12 holes within 10 feet of our foxhole. And I had the platoon sergeant with me, and we had little windows flap. He came in from the side. And he looks out through the burlap we'd hung there, and he said, well, pretty soon it's going to be too late. It's getting dark. Just at that moment, a round came in and hit the foxhole with the prunings around it. And I could hear this guy screaming, and the platoon sergeant already had his boots on. He hadn't taken them off. And I'm fumbling for mine, and he's already out and running across us. And as I got out, trying to get my boots on and try to lace them up, here comes this one kid. And he crawled all the way up to us. And he's screaming and crawling and bloody. And I said, keep crawling. The medics are right over there. And the platoon sergeant was down in his hands and was crawling, and the wounded man, under him, hanging on to him. And just as I got there, the guy let go. The platoon sergeant and I each grabbed an arm, and we're running. I don't know whether that gun had fired its last shell or not. Possibly that was it. But all of us running across that, floundering through that slippery side with this guy and waiting for that gunner to get fire again, And he didn't fire. That was the last round he fired of the day. I think there was one man killed in the whole damn division that day, and he was my guy. And I never forgot it because he's a Polish kid, Polish name. And I'd censored one of his letters to his girlfriend. He said, how much you want to get back and dance with her again? And he was laying there. The shrapnel had really done so much to his legs that when they did lay him down, it almost looked like he was doing a jig. And I think that was probably at least one of my worst moments of the war. But then we did go back to France. By that time, my battalion commander was now the regimental commander, and he brought me back up on his staff. And I went back and met this nurse in Morbihan. We started our own war, and going on ever since.
So how did you and your fellow soldiers entertain yourselves when you weren't fighting?
We weren't fighting. Well, if you had the deck of cards, you played a lot of poker. If it's seldom. Well, for example, when we got back from Holland, we were about 40 miles from Reims, and we give the guys passes. Reims is the way the French pronounce it. We all called it Reims. Unfortunately, the SHAEF headquarters had moved in there. Now, our boys had been up on the line for 72 days, and they were a little rowdy. So the word came down, no more paratroopers can come to Reims. So we were sent into Paris, so that leaves there. But in a quest, you kind of made your own fun with whatever you had to do it with. Card games, if you had cards. You do that. Certainly when you're back in garrison, it was card games and dice, and they had GI movies even when we got back to where they had barracks and things. So they had GI movies they would put on, but mostly you took care of each other. You took whatever little joys you can get. And yet, I ran into a guy. This was toward the end of our careers. We were both teaching at Command and General Staff School. And I was by that time a full colonel, because having stayed in the reserves and all that time. And we recognized each other's names. He had been in another battalion. I couldn't remember him, but we remembered the names. I asked him the question. His name was Bill Horowitz. I said, Bill, why is it? Because we were sitting there destroying a bottle of scotch and reminiscing. Why, when you look back on combat, you're either too hot, too cold, too sick, too scared, why do we go back and chew on it like a sore tooth? He gave me the only reason I've ever heard of any sense. I said, I can tell you that. He says, that's because we were really living. We were so close to dying, we were really living. And I think that's the only answer I ever got that made any sense. You get to the point where after you've been veteran enough, okay, you'll be killed any time. And God wants you, he's going to take you. So enjoy whatever little pleasure you can get.
What did your meals consist of?
Well, when we jumped into combat, we had K rations. A K ration was a box. Oddly enough, they were labeled breakfast, dinner, supper. But bear in mind, back in that generation, the evening meal was supper. The noon meal was dinner, okay? And it had a little can of like at breakfast, you had it's a can with bacon and eggs, really little flakes of bacon in it. And you had a box of crackers, and they had a pack of cigarettes in there, and they had a chocolate bar, usually, or fruit bar. And we jumped, and we had 3 of those jammed in our pockets when we jumped each time. And the paratroopers lived on that a lot until you got what you called C rations, and that was all different cans come in a big box, and you got a bunch of different stuff. The K ration was really the primary ration of the jumpers. Now, when we were in Holland, we had a perpetual stew pot that we kept in a barn, and anybody could find a rabbit or a hen or whatever, or frozen potatoes, threw it in. And that stew just cooked all the time. And you stir it around till you found something that looked like it was done. That's what you would eat it, But there also we had British rations, which is mostly haricot oxtail stew.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
Well, they had the V-mail. You could write letters and mail them, but they also came up with the V-mail, which one page you could write on, several paragraphs, and they would take it and make microfiche on it, send it back and blow it up, again. One plane could carry a gazillion of those compared to sacks of mail, So that was it. But most everybody wrote letters also. My mother kept all of mine that kind of went, but then that's the only contact you had.
So tell us about this love interest that you had throughout the war.
Actually, the love interest up to that time was pretty platonic. There was a nurse that I had met before Normandy, and we'd go to dances and what have you. And I still remember, I think she was probably maybe 4 or 5 years older than I was. I still remember, and she was pretty conscious of that. I came back from Normandy, and she said, at least you're going to come back with a scar or something. And outside that, dating an English girl I met in London, and she corresponded, a few times, but that was another story all in itself. She was, met her on the street, another captain and I, and we turned around and followed her into a store where she was a clerk. And before he could say anything, I said, would you go to the theater with me? So she did, and that was the dinner theater, you know. And I think the Germans were still sending planes over occasionally. I think they sent over about 6 planes that night. And she lived out in East Onslow, which is about 20 miles out. And one of the bombs landed right on the rail line to East Onslow. Now it's dark, and she and her father lived in this place, and they'd been bombed out twice already, and they had no telephone, no way of communicating. All he knew there'd been another bombing raid. So I got to get her home. And we're standing there, and I couldn't bribe a cappy. I couldn't. They wouldn't accept $50 to go 20 miles. They were making more money taking GIs around to all the late night clubs. You know, they get a pound for going 2 blocks if the guy's drunk enough. Anyhow, this British lorry pulls up with the cat lights on. You know, and this British driver, a gal, said, "I say, can you tell me where such and such is?" Well, this gal knew exactly where it was. She worked there. He said, "Thank you very much. Anything I can do for you?" I said, "Not unless you're going out to East Onslow, lady." He said, "Oh, but I am." "Hop in." You know? We're in the back of this, and that's one other episode. They had dropped bombs, and they kept making detours, and there's so much broken glass in the streets that the light from the fires was making it look like they're paved with diamonds. And air raid wardens were constantly saying, you can't to go through here, you got to turn and do that and such. Anyhow, at one point she stopped, and we could hear some British voice talking to her. And all of a sudden the back flap opens, and this Tommy comes in, and he's got this infant that couldn't have been more than a week or 2 old. And one of its eyeballs is laying down on his cheek. And he said in that stoic British way, he said, "I say, sorry to bother you chaps." He said, "My house was bombed, my wife lost her arm, and I just found a baby. Your driver's going to drop me off at the hospital." And he sat there completely stoic, and we just sat there saying nothing, you know. And they dropped her off. That's where the British people were. They had been fighting so long and bombed so long. They were, their upper lip was always stiff, so to speak.
So tell us about how you met your wife.
How I met my wife. Well, we came back from Alsace-Lorraine, and the place where it had been the barracks, the old French army post that we had used, has now been turned into a general hospital. And we were living in tents, but we did have a little semblance of an officers' club with a dance floor, and we were going to have a dance. And so 3 of us decided to go over and get dates. Now, both these guys were older than I, and both married, and both adept at slipping the wedding ring off their left hand into their pocket. And I was a really pretty callow youth, you know. I was never much of a Don Juan. And we go up, and down the steps comes a striking brunette, you know. And before they're trying to decide what approach to use, I say, "Would you go to a dance with me?" She says, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I just got married last week, and so I'm not dating any more near like you." Said, "There's one they call my little sister, and she's on duty right now. But if you'll give me your name," her name is Beth Huey, "I'll tell her you'll come over to see her." So she gives me her name, and one of the guys who came back with me, and she was upstairs writing letters. I can't remember which one of the 2 guys she was engaged to. She actually had 2 proposals. She hadn't accepted them. And I'm thinking I've been semi-introduced, and she thinks I'm from another regiment from somebody she knew there. And and this very convoluted conversation takes place, and the friend with me said, "Boy, leader, does she ever bat it back fast?" We finally did get it straightened out, and she did go to the dance with me. And we dated for 9 straight nights. And then she was shipped to Marseille to go to the Philippines, and I was sent to Germany. And as soon as I got to this new regiment, because our regiment was filled up with High Point people and sent home, and I was transferred to another regiment. And they sent me to athletic officer school in Paris, which was a farce. But a close friend of mine who also had a nurse friend in that unit, knowing they were down at Marseille, said, why don't we catch a plane and go down and visit the girls? We still supposed to have 4 days in the Jeep going back. So we did. The Air Force took us all the way out there. And big sign, all visiting officers must be off the post by midnight. Well, this thing's is 20 miles from anywhere. We did have one bottle of scotch. We found the sergeant major for the post, and we bribed him to put 2 stretchers in the commandant's office after recall at night for us to sleep on. And he did. We did. But anyhow, our correspondence from that time on was really by letter. She was going to the Philippines. And when I retired from my advertising agency and they had a This Is Your Life big surprise party, she was on the program, and her remark was, I was Bill's first direct mail campaign. Hey, once she got back, she was out in Sioux City. My dad was, by that time, his Air Force unit was out at Grand Island, Nebraska, 50 miles away. He said, kid, come on out. You got to go see the pheasant hunting out here. I also wanted to see somebody else, so I'd hunt pheasants with him and get on the bus and go see her. And the process of that, we got engaged, and the rest is history.
We have the next interview group here, and we're on a little bit of a time crunch. Do you have just a couple, maybe like 1 or 2 more important questions?
Sure.
So we could cut you short.
Were you awarded any medals or citations, and how did you get them?
I got the Bronze Star for Valor with the Oak Leaf Cluster. The proudest thing I got was a Combat Infantry Badge, which is very much given away, but I value that more than the things for Valor, because that meant I was in combat as an infantryman, had all the medal, the theater ribbons, that kind of stuff, but never always managed to avoid getting a Purple Heart.
What was the best thing you pulled out of the war?
My wife. Without any question.
Do you have any advice for those in the war today?
Well, I used to give advice when people were going to go back after the war and visit Normandy, you got any advice? I'd say, yeah, keep your head down, run like heck across the open places. The advice of people in the war today is that you are serving your country. You are appreciated for doing that. We pray for you. We're proud of you. And we hope you get home safely. Cut.
And thank you for meeting with us and helping us preserve yet one more veteran's history.
Been a pleasure. Sorry, very pleased to meet you, young lady.
The following oral military history project is a series of documentaries in association with the Lowell area men and women who proudly served and sacrificed part of their lives to preserve the opportunities for all of us to build our businesses and raise our families under a blanket of freedom. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.